Leave Ashcombe Hall before the morning bell, or I shall have you removed by the servants myself." The words fell across the ballroom of Ashcombe Hall with a cruelty that silenced even the musicians near the marble staircase. Lady Theodora Ashcombe stood beside the long table where guests had gathered after dinner, her dark velvet gown untouched by the movement around her, her gloved hand resting upon the back of a chair as if she owned not only the room, but every breath within it. Before her stood Lady Evelyn Ashcombe, the late Duke's only daughter, still wearing the plain black dress she had chosen during her year of mourning. Rain pressed against the tall windows behind her. The candles trembled in their holders. The guests watched. Some looked away out of discomfort. Others smiled. A young gentleman near the fireplace covered a laugh with his wineglass. Evelyn heard it. She heard all of it. The laughter was not the wound. The wound was the silence of the man who could have stopped it. The Duke of Ashcombe, her father, stood only a few steps away. His expression remained unreadable. He did not defend her. He did not question his wife. He simply lowered his eyes toward the carpet, as though the shame belonged to the daughter and not the people humiliating her. Lady Theodora lifted a small envelope from the table. "You have been allowed to remain here out of kindness," she said, "but kindness has limits. Your father's household cannot carry the burden of a daughter who refuses to understand her place." A murmur moved through the room. Evelyn looked at the envelope. She knew what it contained. Not a letter, not an invitation, a dismissal. The same dismissal that had been whispered about in corridors for weeks. The same accusation repeated at breakfast tables and afternoon visits, that Evelyn was ungrateful, that Evelyn was difficult, that Evelyn had no future because she had no husband, no son to inherit through her, and no political value to offer the Ashcombe name. Lady Theodora stepped closer. "You will take what belongs to you and leave through the servants' entrance. It will prevent unnecessary attention." The room became still. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then a woman near the piano laughed softly. It was a small sound. But it was enough. Evelyn felt heat rise beneath her face, not from embarrassment, but from the terrible understanding that everyone had already decided she was defeated. She looked at her father. Father. Only one word. Only one chance. The Duke did not answer. Lady Theodora smiled. That silence was the final answer. Evelyn reached for the envelope. Her fingers did not shake. That was what surprised them. They expected tears. They expected pleading. They expected the daughter of the house to fall apart when the house rejected her. But Evelyn only took the paper, bowed once, and walked toward the door. Behind her, laughter faded. The guests did not know what waited beyond that moment. They did not know that inside Ashcombe Hall, hidden beneath years of carefully arranged lies, there was a truth powerful enough to shake the entire family. And before that truth was revealed, the woman they sent away would discover something no one in that room understood. Her exile was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of the fall of theirs. If you are listening from wherever you are in the world, tell us where you are watching this story from. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of courage, justice, and forgotten voices finding their truth. If you enjoy these stories, your support helps us continue bringing more emotional journeys from the past to life. And now, let us return to the beginning, to the quiet years before Evelyn Ashcombe stood alone in that ballroom. 8 years earlier, Ashcombe Hall had been a place where Evelyn still believed love could protect a person. The great country estate stood among rolling fields and ancient trees in the English countryside. Its stone walls had witnessed generations of Ashcombes entering through the front doors with confidence and leaving only when carried away by age or death. For Evelyn, it had once been home, not because of the grand rooms, not because of the silver trays, the expensive fabrics, or the portraits of ancestors staring down from dark wooden frames. It had been home because her mother had been there. The late Duchess of Ashcombe had been a gentlewoman who believed a daughter's worth did not depend upon marriage or inheritance. She had taught Evelyn to read accounts, to understand estate matters, and to notice the small struggles hidden behind large houses. A servant with worn shoes, a farmer worried about a poor harvest, a child in the village who needed medicine. Her mother had always said that a noble name meant nothing if it could not be used to protect those with less power. But after her death, Ashcombe Hall changed. The change did not come with shouting, it came quietly. That was how powerful people often removed kindness. A different set of footsteps walked through the corridors. A different voice gave instructions. A different woman sat at the head of the dining table. Lady Theodora had entered Ashcombe Hall as the Duke's second wife, during a season when the household was still grieving. She had arrived with perfect manners, carefully chosen words, and a reputation for understanding society. At first, Evelyn had tried to welcome her. She had offered respect. She had offered patience. She had even tried to believe that a new mother figure might bring warmth back into the house. But Theodora had never wanted a daughter. She had wanted control. A daughter with a claim to the Ashcombe name was inconvenient. A daughter who understood the estate accounts was dangerous. A daughter who remembered her mother's wishes was a threat. The first time Evelyn understood this was not after an argument. It was after a document disappeared. A small leather box belonging to her mother had been moved from the library desk. Inside had been old letters, family notes, and papers concerning Evelyn's future. When Evelyn asked about it, Lady Theodora simply smiled. "You are troubled by memories, my dear. Memories can make young women imagine rights they do not possess." Evelyn never forgot those words, not because they hurt, because they revealed the truth. Theodora did not see her as family. She saw her as an obstacle. Years passed, and the distance between them grew. The Duke became quieter. That was his greatest weakness. He was not cruel in the way his wife was cruel. He did not enjoy causing pain, but he loved peace more than justice. And every time Theodora demanded something unreasonable, he chose the easier path. A signed paper, a lowered voice, a closed door. Evelyn learned that a person could be abandoned without ever being physically left alone. She lived in the same house as her father, yet every year she became more like a guest. Her rooms were moved farther from the family apartments. Her invitations to certain gatherings stopped arriving. Her opinions were requested less often. Even the servants changed. Some remained loyal because they remembered the former Duchess. Others followed the new order because they understood where power lived. Only Mrs. Margaret Vale, an elderly housekeeper who had served Ashcombe Hall for more than 30 years, continued to treat Evelyn with quiet respect. One winter evening, while Evelyn was walking through the servants' corridor after visiting the kitchen, Mrs. Vale stopped her. "My lady, there are things in this house that are not being told." Evelyn looked at her carefully. "What things?" The old woman glanced toward the corridor. "Not here." The words were simple, but Evelyn felt their weight. Mrs. Vale had never been a woman who frightened easily. That night, Evelyn returned to her room and opened the small writing desk that had belonged to her mother. Inside the lowest drawer was a hidden compartment. She had found it years earlier but had never opened it, because the lock had been damaged. Now, with careful pressure, the old wood shifted. Inside was a folded piece of paper. No signature, no explanation, only one line written in her mother's handwriting. The original accounts must never be destroyed. Evelyn stared at the sentence for a long time. The room was cold. The fire had nearly gone out. Outside, winter rain moved against the glass. She understood then that whatever Lady Theodora feared was not something from the past. It was something that still existed. The next morning, Evelyn began watching instead of trusting. She noticed the way certain servants avoided questions. She noticed the way her stepmother guarded the library. She noticed that the Duke's solicitor visited more often, but always left through the side entrance. Most importantly, she noticed that whenever the subject of the Ashcombe inheritance was mentioned, Lady Theodora changed the conversation. The truth was hidden somewhere, and Evelyn intended to find it. But searching for truth inside Ashcombe Hall meant moving through a house where every door had ears. The servants' rooms carried whispers. The dining hall carried rumors. The corridors carried secrets. One evening, while passing the library, Evelyn saw light beneath the door. She stopped. The door was slightly open. Inside, voices spoke quietly. Lady Theodora and the Duke. "You must understand," Theodora said. "The estate cannot remain uncertain forever." The Duke answered in a tired voice. "She is my daughter." And she is precisely why this must be handled carefully, Theodora replied. If Evelyn learns what those papers contain, she will believe she has a claim. A pause followed. Then the Duke said something that made Evelyn's heart tighten. What if she does? The silence after those words was longer than any argument. Evelyn stepped away before they discovered her. She did not run. She did not cry. For the first time in her life, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt certainty. Her stepmother was not trying to remove her because she was difficult. She was trying to remove her because Evelyn was standing in the way of something valuable. And whatever that something was, someone had already decided Evelyn must disappear before she found it. The following week, Lady Theodora made her move. Not privately, not gently, publicly, because humiliation was always more effective when witnesses were present. The ballroom dismissal was only the beginning. The envelope in Evelyn's hand contained a formal instruction to leave Ashcombe Hall, but hidden beneath the folded paper was something else, a small mark, a name, a clue left behind by someone who knew the truth had not yet been buried. Evelyn did not know who had placed it there. She did not know whether the person was friend or enemy. She only knew one thing. Before she walked into the rain outside Ashcombe Hall, she would have to decide whether to run from the house that rejected her, or return to it one day, carrying the truth that could bring it to its knees. Evelyn did not leave Ashcombe Hall that night with the broken pride Lady Theodora expected to see. She left with a question. And questions, she had learned from her mother, were sometimes more powerful than accusations. The rain had already begun before the carriage was brought around. It fell steadily over the gravel drive, turning the path dark and shining beneath the weak glow of the lanterns held by the footmen. The front entrance remained closed. No one came to say farewell. No one came to offer kindness. Only Mrs. Margaret Vale appeared at the servants' doorway, holding a small travelling case that Evelyn had not packed herself. "My lady," the housekeeper whispered, placing it into her hands. Evelyn looked at the case. "Where did this come from?" Mrs. Vale hesitated. "From a place that belonged to your mother." The answer was strange enough that Evelyn almost asked another question. Almost. But then she noticed something. The old woman's eyes moved toward the upper windows of Ashcombe Hall, not toward the Duke's rooms, not toward Lady Theodora's chambers, toward the library. Someone had been watching. Someone had known Evelyn was leaving. Mrs. Vale lowered her voice. "Do not open it until you are somewhere safe." Safe. The word felt unfamiliar. For years, Evelyn had believed Ashcombe Hall was the safest place in the world because it was her family home. Now she understood that walls could shelter a person and imprison them at the same time. She stepped closer to the carriage. The driver avoided her eyes. The footman remained silent. The servants who had once bowed to her now looked uncertain, trapped between sympathy and fear. Evelyn did not blame them. Fear was a powerful master in houses like Ashcombe Hall. She placed one gloved hand on the carriage door. Then she stopped. For a moment, she looked back. The great windows of the ballroom glowed warmly behind the rain. Inside were the people who had watched her humiliation, the people who had laughed, the people who had chosen comfort over courage. But Evelyn also saw something else, the house itself, the place where her mother had taught her kindness, the library where the missing papers had once rested, the corridors where servants carried truths that nobles ignored. She understood then that leaving did not mean losing. Not yet. She entered the carriage. As it moved away from Ashcombe Hall, the estate disappeared slowly behind the curtain of rain. But Evelyn did not cry. The first time in her life she had been forced to walk away from everything familiar, she discovered she was not as powerless as she had believed. Because she was not leaving with nothing. She had the hidden note. She had Mrs. Vale's warning. And she had a name. A name written on the small mark hidden inside the envelope. Valencrest. She had never seen it before, but someone at Ashcombe Hall had, and someone had been afraid enough to hide it. The journey to London took several hours by carriage and rail, and by the time Evelyn reached the modest lodging arranged through an old family acquaintance, her fine mourning dress was damp at the edges, and her hands were cold from gripping the small travelling case. The room was nothing like Ashcombe Hall. There were no portraits. No servants waiting nearby, no polished silver, only a small fireplace, a narrow bed, and a wooden table near the window. Yet when Evelyn closed the door behind her, she experienced something unexpected. Peace, not happiness, not relief. Something quieter, the knowledge that no one in the next room could order her to disappear. That night, she opened the case. Inside was not jewelry, not money, not anything that could immediately restore her position. There were 3 items: a worn account book, a sealed letter, and a small key. Evelyn held the key carefully. She knew that key. It belonged to the old library cabinet where her mother had kept estate records, the cabinet that Lady Theodora had ordered, removed after the Duchess's death. Her heart began beating faster. She opened the account book first. The pages contained numbers, payments, transfers, estate expenses. At first, they appeared ordinary, but then Evelyn noticed something. Several amounts had been written, erased, and rewritten. Not once, not twice, many times. Someone had been altering the accounts. She leaned closer to the candle. The handwriting was not her mother's. It was not Mrs. Vale's. It belonged to someone else, someone inside Ashcombe Hall. The next morning, Evelyn did something she had never done before. She walked into London alone. The city was different from the countryside. Ashcombe Hall had been built on tradition. London moved on opportunity. Here, people did not always ask who your father was before asking what you could do. For the first time in her life, Evelyn entered a place where her surname was not the only thing people noticed. She visited a solicitor recommended by her mother years earlier, a careful older gentleman named Mr. Edward Harcourt. When he saw the account book, his expression changed. "Lady Evelyn," he said quietly, "where did you obtain this?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She had spent years surrounded by people who turned information into weapons. Trust had become something she offered carefully. "From my mother's belongings." Mr. Harcourt studied the pages. "Your mother was wise." That was all he said. But Evelyn heard the meaning behind it. "You knew something." The solicitor looked toward the window. "There are matters involving the Ashcombe estate that were never properly settled. Why? Because after your mother's death, certain instructions were withdrawn." "By whom?" Mr. Harcourt did not respond. He did not need to. Evelyn already knew. The silence itself gave the answer. When she returned to her lodging that evening, she found a small envelope beneath her door. No name, no seal, only 3 words written on the outside. "Stop searching, Evelyn." Her first reaction was fear, not because of the warning, because of what it proved. Someone knew. Someone in Ashcombe Hall knew she had begun looking. She carried the letter to the fireplace. The flame moved gently. For years, she had been told that obedience was the price of belonging, that a woman without protection must remain quiet. That dignity meant accepting what powerful people decided. But standing alone in that small London room, Evelyn understood something for the first time. It was not that she had lost her home. It was that she had finally stepped outside a place that wanted her silent. She folded the warning letter and placed it beside the account book. Then she took out a fresh sheet of paper. If Ashcombe Hall had hidden the truth through money and influence, she would uncover it through patience, through records, through witnesses, through the very things Lady Theodora believed a dismissed daughter could never obtain. And somewhere beyond London, beneath the roof of the house that had rejected her, the Duke of Ashcombe was beginning to realize that sending Evelyn away had not removed the danger. It had given her the freedom to find it. For the first time since leaving Ashcombe Hall, Evelyn allowed herself to consider a future that was not determined by another person's decision. It was not a grand future. It was not filled with titles, invitations, or crowded rooms where every smile carried a hidden meaning. It was smaller, and because it was smaller, it felt more honest. She began by doing what her mother had taught her years before. She worked. Not because she had suddenly forgotten her position, not because she had accepted that Lady Theodora was right, but because Evelyn understood that a person who depended entirely upon another person's mercy could never truly be free. The small room in London became her place of preparation. Each morning, while carriages rushed through the wet streets outside and shopkeepers lifted their shutters against the cold, Evelyn studied the account book. She copied numbers. She compared dates. She followed the movement of money. The work was slow, but it gave her something Ashcombe Hall had taken from her: control. She also began visiting a modest neighborhood near the markets, where families often needed help managing household accounts and correspondence. At first, people were uncertain. A lady of noble birth offering to assist with ordinary matters seemed unusual. But Evelyn did not arrive expecting admiration. She arrived willing to listen. A widow who owned a small fabric shop asked her to help organize years of unpaid bills. A retired clerk asked her to review his savings records. A young woman preparing to marry needed help understanding the finances she would bring into her new household. Evelyn discovered that knowledge was not made valuable by the room where it was used. A ledger in a grand library and a ledger in a small shop still required honesty, and numbers did not care about titles. One evening, as rain struck the window of her lodging, Evelyn received another visit from Mr. Harcourt. The solicitor carried a folder beneath his arm. "I have found something concerning," he said. Evelyn immediately noticed his expression. Not fear, concern. "That was different. What did you find?" Mr. Harcourt placed several papers on the table. "These are copies of estate payments made after your mother's death." Evelyn studied them. The figures matched the account book. Money had been moved from one part of the Ashcombe estate into another account. An account connected to someone who had no obvious reason to control it. Who? The solicitor hesitated. A person connected to Lady Theodora. Evelyn looked up. Not the Duke? No. That answer should have comforted her. Instead, it made the situation more complicated. Her father might not have created the deception, but he had allowed it to happen. The hardest truth was not always discovering who had done wrong. Sometimes it was discovering who had chosen not to stop it. Mr. Harcourt lowered his voice. "There is more." Evelyn waited. "Your mother left instructions with another solicitor before she died. Instructions regarding your inheritance." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Why was I never told?" "Because the instructions were never presented." "By whom?" Again, silence answered before words did. The solicitor did not need to say Lady Theodora's name. Evelyn looked toward the dark window. The rain outside reminded her of the night she left Ashcombe Hall. She had thought that moment was the deepest wound. She had been wrong. The deepest wound was realizing how long people had been deciding her fate while she was still living inside the house. Mr. Harcourt gathered the papers. "There is one difficulty." "What difficulty?" "The original documents are missing." Evelyn looked at the small key beside the account book. "The library cabinet." The solicitor followed her gaze. "You believe they are still there?" "I believe my mother hid what she wanted protected. And I believe someone failed to find everything." For several moments neither spoke. The room was quiet, not the empty silence of Ashcombe Hall's ballroom. Not the cold silence of a family refusing to defend her. This silence belonged to two people facing a difficult truth. Evelyn had the first pieces, but pieces were not enough. She needed the whole picture. The following week she made a decision that surprised even Mr. Harcourt. She would return near Ashcombe, not to beg, not to ask forgiveness, not to demand that her father suddenly become the man she had needed him to be. She would return because the truth was still inside those walls, and she needed to know who had hidden it. Before leaving London, Evelyn met Mrs. Vale in a quiet tea room away from the main streets. The old housekeeper looked older than she had a week before. Fear had a way of adding years. "You should not have come back so soon," Mrs. Vale whispered. "I did not come back to stay." The woman studied her. "Then why?" "Because someone tried to frighten me into stopping." Mrs. Vale looked down. "That means they know." "Yes, and that means they are worried." The old woman was silent. Then, carefully, she reached into her handbag and removed a small folded paper. "I found this after you left." Evelyn unfolded it. It was a note written years earlier, her mother's handwriting. Only a few words. "If anything happens to me, trust Margaret. Do not trust the accounts shown after my death." Evelyn felt the weight of the paper. Her mother had known. She had suspected something, and she had tried to leave a path behind. A path that had taken years to find. Mrs. Vale closed her hand over Evelyn's. "Your mother always said you were stronger than this house believed." For a moment, Evelyn nearly allowed herself to feel the grief she had carried for years. But she did not break. Not then, because she understood something important. Her mother had not left her only a secret. She had left her faith. When Evelyn returned toward Ashcombe Hall, she did not arrive as the daughter who had been ordered away. She arrived as a woman who had built something beyond those walls. She had earned money through her own efforts. She had gained knowledge. She had found allies. And she had discovered that the people who controlled the house were not as powerful as they appeared. Yet when the carriage approached the estate, Evelyn saw something that made her pause. A second carriage stood outside the entrance. Not a family carriage. A visitor's carriage. A stranger had arrived at Ashcombe Hall, and whoever that person was, Lady Theodora had not expected them. Evelyn watched from a distance as the front doors opened. For the first time since her exile, she felt something close to certainty. The truth was no longer hidden. It was moving, and soon, everyone inside Ashcombe Hall would have to face what they had tried to bury. The stranger inside Ashcombe Hall was not a guest. Lady Theodora welcomed with pleasure. Evelyn knew that before she ever learned his name. From the shadow of the trees beyond the carriage path, she watched the movement of the household. Servants who usually walked with measured calm hurried between the entrance and the library. The footman who had once avoided her gaze now carried messages with visible unease. Something had changed. Ashcombe Hall was a house built on appearances. Even its smallest movements had always been controlled. But that afternoon, control had begun to slip. Evelyn waited until evening before approaching the village inn where she had arranged to stay. She did not return to the estate immediately. The woman who had left Ashcombe Hall in the rain would have rushed toward answers. The woman who returned understood that answers were dangerous things. They had to be collected carefully. Inside the small room at the inn, she placed her traveling case beside the chair and looked again at the papers she carried. The account book, her mother's note, the copies from Mr. Harcourt, pieces of a story. But not yet the whole truth. The next morning, Evelyn walked to the village market. It was not the place where Ashcombe's nobles gathered. There were no chandeliers, no polished floors, no carefully rehearsed conversations. There were only farmers, shopkeepers, workers, and families trying to make their way through the winter cold. And here, Evelyn found something Ashcombe Hall had always underestimated. People remembered. An elderly man who sold vegetables recognized her immediately. "Lady Evelyn?" The question carried surprise. She smiled politely. "You remember me?" The man looked uncomfortable. "Everyone remembers the Duchess." He paused. "And everyone remembers what happened afterward." Evelyn did not press him. Not yet. Instead, she asked a simpler question. "Do you remember my mother's solicitor?" The old man looked toward the street. A woman named Mrs. Vale had warned him, years ago, not to speak about certain matters. That answer told Evelyn more than a direct confession could have. The silence surrounding her mother had been built by many hands, not only Lady Theodora's. Later that afternoon, Evelyn met with a former Ashcombe employee named Thomas Bell, a retired gardener who lived in a small cottage near the edge of the village. Mrs. Vale had arranged the meeting. Thomas opened the door slowly. When he saw Evelyn, he removed his hat. "My lady." "Please," Evelyn said. "I am not here as someone from Ashcombe Hall." The old gardener studied her. "That may be true. But Ashcombe Hall has followed you here." His words unsettled her. "What do you mean?" Thomas stepped aside and allowed her inside. The cottage was simple. A small fire burned in the hearth. A few tools rested near the wall. The room felt honest. Unlike the rooms where powerful people had hidden their decisions, Thomas poured tea before speaking. "Your mother was worried before she died. About what?" "The accounts." Evelyn remained still. She had expected the answer, but hearing it aloud changed something. Thomas continued. "She believed money was being moved from the estate without proper explanation. She asked questions. And after she asked those questions, people began saying she was too delicate, too emotional, too confused." Evelyn felt the old anger rise. Not because she had never heard those accusations, because she finally understood their purpose. They had not simply attacked her mother's reputation. They had prepared the household to ignore her. "Who helped her?" Evelyn asked. Thomas looked down. A man from London, a solicitor, but he disappeared after the Duchess died. Mr. Harcourt? No, someone else. Someone who knew the original documents existed. Evelyn leaned forward. Did you see them? The old gardener hesitated. Then he nodded. Only once. The papers were moved from the library cabinet before the Duke signed the new arrangements. Who moved them? Thomas looked toward the window. A servant saw. But that servant was dismissed the next day. The room became quiet, not because there was nothing left to say, because Evelyn understood that the truth was finally approaching the surface. Someone had removed evidence. Someone had controlled information. Someone had spent years making sure no one could connect the pieces. But there was another question. Why had they left the account book behind? Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. Because whoever did it was in a hurry. They believed they had removed everything important. Evelyn looked down at her mother's note. They had been wrong. That evening, Evelyn returned near Ashcombe Hall. She did not enter. She waited. From the road, she saw a figure leave through the side entrance. It was her father. The Duke walked alone, without servants, without his usual confidence. For the first time, Evelyn noticed something she had not allowed herself to see before. He looked tired. Not like a man who had won, like a man who had spent years avoiding something he could no longer escape. She almost called out. Almost. But then another figure appeared behind him, Lady Theodora. Her stepmother's voice carried faintly through the cold air. You cannot change what has already been decided. The Duke answered quietly. I should have asked questions. Evelyn froze. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first sign that her father was no longer completely hidden behind silence. Lady Theodora stepped closer. You are becoming sentimental. No. The Duke's voice was firmer. I am becoming aware of what I allowed. The words struck Evelyn harder than she expected. Because for years, the hardest part had not been Lady Theodora's cruelty. It had been her father's absence. A cruel person could be fought. A silent person could only leave another person alone. Evelyn stepped back into the darkness before they noticed her. She returned to the inn carrying a new understanding. Her father might not have been the architect of the injustice, but he had helped build the walls around it. And now those walls were beginning to crack. The following day, a message arrived from Mr. Harcourt. The handwriting was urgent. He requested Evelyn return to London immediately. A witness had been found. A witness who had kept silent for years. A witness who had been present when the original inheritance papers were taken. But beneath the message was a warning. Do not reveal what you know until the proper moment. Because if Lady Theodora learns who has spoken, she will attempt to destroy the evidence before anyone can see it. Evelyn folded the letter carefully. For the first time since leaving Ashcombe Hall, she did not feel like someone escaping. She felt like someone preparing. The next move would not be made in a quiet room. It would be made where Ashcombe valued appearances most, before the eyes of society. And Lady Theodora, who had once used a ballroom to destroy Evelyn's reputation, would soon discover that the same room could become the place where the truth finally entered. The journey back to London felt different from the journey away from Ashcombe Hall. When Evelyn had left before, every mile between the estate and the city had felt like another piece of her old life being taken from her. Now, every mile felt like preparation. She was no longer carrying only grief. She carried evidence. She carried names. She carried the quiet certainty that the people who had pushed her into the rain had never truly understood what they had done. They had not removed a powerless daughter. They had released a witness. When she arrived at Mr. Harcourt's office, the solicitor was waiting beside a desk covered with documents. But he was not alone. An older woman sat near the window. Her hands trembled slightly around a small cup of tea. Evelyn recognized her after a moment. Not from society. Not from Ashcombe gatherings. From memory. She had been a maid in the household years ago, Mrs. Clara Whitmore. The woman who had vanished shortly after Evelyn's mother died. Mrs. Whitmore stood when Evelyn entered. My lady. Evelyn approached slowly. You worked at Ashcombe Hall. Yes. Why did you leave? The woman looked down. Because I saw something I was not meant to see. The answer carried no drama, only exhaustion. Evelyn sat opposite her. Tell me. Mrs. Whitmore glanced at Mr. Harcourt before speaking. The night before the new inheritance arrangements were announced, Lady Theodora entered the library. She was not alone. Who was with her? A man from London, a legal advisor. Evelyn's expression remained calm, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her glove. Did you hear what they discussed? Not everything. The door was nearly closed. But I heard one sentence. Mrs. Whitmore paused, and I remember it because I knew immediately something was wrong. What did she say? The woman swallowed. She said, "The girl must believe she has nothing left." The room became silent, not the silence of fear. The silence of truth finally being spoken. Evelyn looked toward the window. For years, she had wondered whether she had imagined the cruelty, whether perhaps she had been too sensitive, whether perhaps her mother's lessons had made her expect a kindness that the world did not owe her. Now she understood. The rejection had not happened naturally. It had been arranged, carefully, patiently. Mrs. Whitmore continued. There was another thing. What? The original papers were not destroyed. Evelyn turned back. Where are they? I do not know, but I know they were moved. By whom? The former maid looked uncomfortable. By the Duke. Evelyn felt the answer strike harder than expected. Her father? Mrs. Whitmore nodded. But my lady, I do not believe he understood what he was carrying. He trusted Lady Theodora. He believed he was protecting the family name. Those words should have softened Evelyn. They did not, because she knew something important. A person could cause harm without intending cruelty. A person could still be responsible. Mr. Harcourt carefully arranged the papers. The question now is not only what happened, the question is how we prove it. Evelyn looked at the documents. The answer was clear. They needed Ashcombe Hall, not the building, not the title, the people, the memories, the witnesses. The truth had survived because ordinary people had protected small pieces of it. A servant had remembered. A gardener had spoken. A solicitor had preserved copies. Her mother had hidden a clue. Evelyn finally understood that power had never belonged only to those sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it belonged to those who remembered what happened when everyone else pretended to forget. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived. It came from Ashcombe Hall. A winter gathering, a formal evening attended by several members of the local nobility. Lady Theodora had arranged it. Mr. Harcourt studied the card carefully. This is unexpected. No. Evelyn looked at the elegant writing. It is deliberate. Why would she invite you? Because she believes she has already won. The solicitor looked concerned. Or because she knows you are searching. Evelyn folded the invitation. Then we must make sure she does not know how much we have found. The return to Ashcombe Hall would not be as a daughter seeking approval. It would not be as a woman asking for a place she had been denied. She would enter as someone who understood the rules of the room, a room where reputation was currency, a room where a whisper could destroy a person, and a room where, once before, laughter had followed her humiliation. But this time would be different. Before leaving London, Evelyn visited a small dressmaker near the market. She did not ask for the finest silk. She did not ask for the most expensive materials. She chose a simple dark gown with careful stitching. The dressmaker looked surprised. You could afford something far grander, my lady. Evelyn smiled faintly. That is not what I need. For the first time in her life, she was not dressing to prove she belonged among the wealthy. She was dressing to remind herself that she belonged wherever she stood. When the carriage carried her toward Ashcombe Hall again, the rain returned. The same cold rain. The same grey sky. But Evelyn was not the same woman who had walked through that gate carrying a dismissal letter. She carried no anger sharp enough to blind her, no desire to wound anyone in return. Only the determination to let the truth stand where lies had stood for years. As the estate came into view, she saw the ballroom windows glowing warmly. Inside, guests were already arriving. The same kind of people who had watched her leave, the same kind of people who had believed the story Lady Theodora created. But this time among them would be a witness, among them would be evidence, and among them would be Evelyn herself, not as the daughter they discarded, but as the woman who had returned carrying the one thing Ashcombe Hall could not control, the truth. The moment Evelyn stepped through the doors of Ashcombe Hall, she felt the weight of every eye in the room, not because she had returned unexpectedly, because she had returned differently. The ballroom was almost exactly as she remembered it. The same polished floor, the same tall windows, the same portraits watching silently from the walls. Even the chandelier above them seemed unchanged, scattering warm light across a room where cold judgments had once been spoken so easily. But Evelyn was not the woman who had stood there months earlier holding a dismissal letter. She entered with calm steps. No apology, no hesitation, no request to be welcomed. The conversations around her slowed. A gentleman near the fireplace lowered his glass. A lady beside the piano whispered something to her companion. The news had already travelled. The daughter of Ashcombe had returned. Lady Theodora appeared moments later. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, decorated with pearls and careful embroidery. She looked exactly as she always had. Perfect, controlled, untouched. Evelyn almost admired the skill. Almost. "My dear Evelyn," Theodora said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How unexpected." Evelyn gave a polite bow. "Lady Theodora." The response was simple, but it carried something that unsettled her stepmother. There was no bitterness, no desperation, no anger to manipulate. Only composure. Theodora moved closer. "I hope London has treated you kindly." "It has taught me many things," Evelyn replied. "Such as that people are often more honest when they have nothing to gain from a person's name." For the smallest moment, Lady Theodora's expression changed. Then the smile returned. How poetic, how unnecessary. Evelyn looked around the ballroom. The guests had begun pretending not to listen, but they were listening. Everyone in that room had always listened. They simply preferred to pretend they had not. The evening continued with polite conversation. A tray of refreshments moved through the room. Guests discussed marriages, estates, and distant relatives. The usual subjects of a world where reputation mattered more than truth. Evelyn watched carefully. She noticed which guests avoided speaking to her. She noticed which servants looked relieved to see her. She noticed her father. The Duke stood near the far end of the room, older than she remembered, more tired. When their eyes met, he looked away first. That hurt more than she expected, not because she wanted him to run toward her, because some small part of her had still hoped he would. She had spent years waiting for him to choose her, waiting for him to say the words he should have said long ago. But Evelyn finally understood that waiting could become another kind of prison. She would not build her future around a door someone else refused to open. Later in the evening, Lady Theodora approached her near the library entrance. A curious place to stand, Evelyn thought, because the library had always been where secrets lived. "I hear you have become quite busy in London," Theodora said. "I have. Helping people with their accounts? Yes. How admirable." The words sounded like praise. They were not. For a woman of your position, such work is rather unusual. Evelyn looked at her calmly. "Perhaps. But useful things are often unusual before people understand their value." Lady Theodora's fingers tightened around her fan. "You have changed." Yes. Evelyn did not deny it. That seemed to trouble Theodora more than an argument would have. A person who could be provoked, could be controlled. A person who had found herself was far more difficult. "Then perhaps you have also changed your understanding of your place," Theodora said. Evelyn looked directly at her. "I have." The response was so quiet that it carried farther than anger. "My place is not decided by someone else's approval." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then a servant approached Lady Theodora. "My lady, the Duke requests your presence in the library." Theodora's eyes moved toward the door. Concern appeared briefly, only briefly, but Evelyn saw it, and she remembered. Fear, real fear. Not the fear of losing a social gathering. Something deeper, something connected to the papers hidden years ago. After Theodora left, Evelyn remained near the library entrance. She did not follow. Not immediately. She had learned patience. Instead, she waited. Minutes passed. The ballroom continued around her. Then she heard voices through the slightly open door. Not clearly, only fragments. But enough. You knew the documents existed. The Duke's voice. "And you allowed me to believe they were gone." Lady Theodora answered, lower, sharper. "You signed what needed to be signed." A pause. Then the Duke said, "Because I trusted you." The words carried disappointment, not anger, and somehow that made them more painful. Evelyn stood still. She had wanted proof. She had wanted confirmation. But hearing her father admit his mistake did not bring satisfaction. It brought sorrow, because the truth was worse than she had imagined. He had not been unaware. He had simply been willing to believe what was convenient. The door moved slightly. Evelyn stepped away before anyone could see her. But someone else had heard. At the end of the corridor stood Mrs. Vale. The old housekeeper looked at Evelyn. Neither woman spoke. They did not need to. For once, the truth had not been carried by whispers alone. It had been spoken inside the very house that had tried to bury it. And tomorrow night, Ashcombe Hall would host its grandest gathering of the season. A gathering where Lady Theodora intended to announce a future that would secure her control over the estate forever. She did not know that the same evening would bring the witness she feared. She did not know the documents she believed lost were about to return. And she did not know that Evelyn Ashcombe was no longer fighting to remain inside the family she had lost. She was fighting to reveal why she had been forced to leave it. The following morning, Ashcombe Hall woke beneath a heavy winter sky. The servants moved quietly through the corridors, preparing for the evening gathering. Silver was polished, curtains were adjusted, candles were counted and placed carefully. Everything had to appear perfect. That was the way Ashcombe Hall survived, by making certain that no one could see the cracks. But Evelyn noticed them now. She noticed the hesitation of the servants when Lady Theodora gave instructions. She noticed the way the Duke remained in his study longer than usual. She noticed that Mrs. Vale avoided passing near the library unless someone else was present. The house was no longer protecting its secrets. It was beginning to surrender them. Before noon, Evelyn received a message from Mr. Harcourt. "The witness has arrived." The words were brief, but they changed the entire course of the day. The witness was not Mrs. Whitmore. She had already spoken. This was someone else. Someone who had been absent for years. Someone Lady Theodora believed could never return. Evelyn met Mr. Harcourt in a small private room near the village church. The cold air entered through the gaps around the old windows, and the sound of distant church bells moved through the grey afternoon. Standing beside him was a man in his late years. His clothes were plain, his posture was tired, but his eyes were sharp. Evelyn recognized him after a moment. Mr. Henry Bellamy, the former clerk of Ashcombe Hall, the man responsible for recording estate payments before Lady Theodora replaced him. "I thought you had left England," Evelyn said. "I was told it would be safer if I did." The answer was quiet, but it carried years of fear. Mr. Bellamy removed a small leather folder from inside his coat. "I kept these because I knew one day someone would need them." Inside were copies of estate transactions, letters between the estate office and the solicitor, and one document that made Evelyn stop breathing for a moment. It was her mother's handwriting, a draft of instructions. Her eyes moved over the page. "If my daughter is denied her rightful protection, these records must be presented." Evelyn touched the paper carefully. Her mother had known. Not everything. Not the full plan, but enough to understand that danger existed. "Why did you wait so long?" Evelyn asked. Mr. Bellamy looked down. "Because I was afraid." The answer was honest, and somehow that honesty mattered. "I had a family. I had children. When Lady Theodora removed me from my position, she made it clear that speaking against her would cost me everything." Evelyn looked at him. She could have judged him. She could have asked why courage arrived so late, but she understood something now. Fear did not always make people cruel. Sometimes it made them silent. And silence, she had learned, could still cause harm. Mr. Harcourt carefully gathered the documents. "These are enough to challenge the arrangements." "Enough?" "Not alone." Evelyn understood. The papers were powerful, but paper did not move a room. People did. They needed the right moment, the right witnesses, the right place, the ballroom. The same room where Lady Theodora had expected Evelyn to break. The same room where society had accepted the story told about her. That evening, Evelyn returned to Ashcombe Hall with a calmness that surprised even herself. Lady Theodora was waiting, not in the ballroom, in the library. A deliberate choice, the room where the truth had been hidden, the room where Evelyn's mother had once kept her records. "You have become very determined," Theodora said. Evelyn closed the door behind her. "I have become tired of being misunderstood." Lady Theodora gave a small smile. "Misunderstood? Is that what you call it? What else should I call it?" Theodora walked toward the desk. "You have always believed yourself to be different, more intelligent, more deserving." Evelyn looked at her. "No, I believed I deserved honesty." The statement unsettled her stepmother, because it was impossible to argue against. Lady Theodora opened a drawer and removed a small paper. "For years, I have protected this family from uncertainty." Evelyn watched carefully. "You mean you protected yourself?" Theodora's expression hardened. Careful, there it was, the old warning, the old method. A reminder that Evelyn was expected to fear consequences. But fear had already taken everything from her once. It no longer had the same power. Theodora stepped closer. "You think those papers will save you? They will not change society. They will not erase what people believed." Evelyn looked around the library, at the shelves, at the locked cabinets, at the room where so many decisions had been made without her. "Perhaps not." She paused. "But they may reveal who made those decisions." For the first time, Lady Theodora lost control of her expression. Only for a second, but Evelyn saw it. The fear, the knowledge, the realization that the daughter she had dismissed was no longer searching blindly. Theodora quickly recovered. "You should be careful about making accusations." Evelyn nodded. "I agree. That is why I brought evidence." Silence filled the room, not the silence of weakness, the silence before a storm. From outside the library came the sound of footsteps. The Duke. Neither woman moved. The door opened. The Duke of Ashcombe stood there. His eyes moved from his wife to his daughter. And for the first time in years, he did not look away. Evelyn saw something in his face. Regret. Not enough. Not yet. But real. "I owe you an explanation," he said. Evelyn remained still. "You owe me more than that." The Duke lowered his head. "I know." And those two words carried the weight of everything he had refused to say before. The night of the gathering was approaching. The witnesses were ready. The documents were prepared. But one final question remained. Would the Duke stand beside the truth when everyone was watching? Or would he choose silence one more time? The Duke remained in the doorway for several moments. The library seemed smaller with all three of them inside. For years, it had been a room where decisions were made quietly, where papers changed hands, where voices lowered when servants passed nearby. But now there was nowhere left to hide. Evelyn looked at her father. She wanted to see the man who had held her hand when she was a child, the man who had once promised her mother that he would protect their daughter. Instead, she saw a man standing between regret and responsibility. The Duke closed the door behind him. "I should have listened to you." Evelyn's expression did not change. "When?" The question was quiet, but it carried every year of disappointment. The Duke looked down. "After your mother died. After Theodora began changing the household. After I noticed you were becoming a stranger in your own home." He stopped. "I should have acted then." Evelyn looked toward the shelves of the library. "No, you should have acted many times." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. The Duke accepted them. Yes, that was what made the silence afterward different. He did not defend himself. He did not blame circumstances. He did not say he had been misled. For once, he allowed the weight of his choices to belong to him. "I thought preserving the family name was the same as protecting the family," he said. Evelyn turned back. "And now?" The Duke looked toward the locked cabinet. "Now I believe I protected a name while allowing the people who carried it to suffer." Lady Theodora watched him carefully. Evelyn noticed. That was the moment she understood something important. Her stepmother had expected many things: anger, tears, desperation. She had not expected the Duke to question her. "You are allowing yourself to be influenced by emotion," Theodora said. The Duke looked at her. "No. For the first time in many years, I am allowing myself to consider the truth, The words changed the room, because they were not spoken as a husband defending a wife. They were spoken as a man finally recognizing the damage caused by his silence. Lady Theodora's composure weakened, only slightly, but Evelyn saw it. The perfect image was beginning to fail. Theodora moved toward the desk. "You forget what is at stake. The estate, the title, the reputation of Ashcombe." Evelyn answered before her father could. "No, what is at stake is whether those things were ever built on something honest." Lady Theodora looked at her. "You think society will welcome your accusations?" Evelyn held her gaze. "I do not need society to welcome the truth. I need society to hear it." The next evening, Ashcombe Hall opened its doors. The gathering was larger than usual. Lady Theodora had arranged everything carefully. There were guests from neighboring estates, several respected families from the county, people who carried influence through their names and connections. The ballroom was filled with conversation. Chandeliers shone above them. Servants moved between guests, carrying trays of champagne glasses, delicate pastries, and small dishes prepared for the occasion. Everything appeared exactly as Lady Theodora intended. A perfect evening, a perfect family, a perfect lie. Evelyn entered beside Mr. Harcourt. The reaction was immediate. The conversations changed. The same people who had watched her humiliation now watched her return. But this time no one laughed. Lady Theodora stood near the center of the room. "My friends," she announced, "tonight is a celebration of Ashcombe's continued stability and future." Evelyn noticed the choice of words. Future, not truth. Not justice, future. Lady Theodora was preparing the room before the revelation. She was reminding everyone what she wanted them to believe. The Duke stood nearby. For a moment, Evelyn wondered if he would step forward, if he would speak, if he would finally choose. Then Lady Theodora lifted her glass. "Before we begin, there is one matter I wish to address." The room quieted. Evelyn felt every person turn toward her. Lady Theodora smiled sadly. "There have been unfortunate misunderstandings regarding certain family matters." There it was, not an accusation, something more dangerous, a suggestion, a way to make Evelyn appear unstable without directly attacking her. "Some people, after difficult experiences, struggle to accept reality," Theodora continued. A murmur moved through the room. Evelyn felt the old trap closing, the same one used against her mother. Question the woman, question her emotions, question her memory. Then no one has to answer her evidence. But before Lady Theodora could continue, a voice came from the back of the ballroom. "That is not what happened." Everyone turned. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the entrance. The former maid looked nervous, but she did not move away. Lady Theodora's face changed, only for a moment, but everyone saw it. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward. "I served this family for many years. I remained silent because I feared losing everything. But silence allowed a wrong to continue. The ballroom became still. Evelyn watched the guests. The same people who had once enjoyed the comfort of not knowing now had to face the discomfort of hearing. Then Mr. Harcourt stepped forward, and behind him stood Mr. Bellamy. The former estate clerk placed the leather folder on the table. Lady Theodora looked at the documents, and for the first time that evening, she looked afraid, because the evidence had not appeared from nowhere. It had returned from the very people she believed had no power. The servants, the workers, the forgotten witnesses. The people who had carried pieces of the truth while the powerful tried to bury it. The Duke looked at his wife. The room waited. And Evelyn knew the moment had arrived. Not the moment when she would reclaim a title. Not the moment when she would defeat an enemy. The moment when everyone in Ashcombe Hall would finally have to answer one question. What had they chosen to ignore? The ballroom remained silent. Not the uncomfortable silence that followed gossip. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a speech to end. This was the silence of a room realizing that the story it had accepted for years was about to change. Lady Theodora looked at Mr. Harcourt, then at Mr. Bellamy, then at Mrs. Whitmore. 3 people, 3 witnesses. 3 voices she had believed were too insignificant to matter. "You are making a spectacle of a private family matter," Theodora said. Her voice was controlled again. Almost. But Evelyn noticed the difference. Before, her stepmother had spoken as someone certain of victory. Now she spoke as someone trying to delay defeat. Mr. Harcourt stepped forward. "This is not a spectacle, Lady Theodora." He placed the documents on the table. "It is a correction of records that were altered and concealed." A murmur spread through the guests. Lady Theodora's eyes narrowed. "Altered? You are accusing me of fraud?" "No." Mr. Harcourt's reply was calm. "I am presenting evidence that requires explanation." That difference mattered. Evelyn understood it. The truth did not need anger. It needed patience. Mr. Bellamy opened the folder. "For years, I managed the estate accounts of Ashcombe Hall." The room listened. "After the Duchess's death, I noticed several unusual transfers, payments that did not correspond with estate needs, funds moved without proper explanation." Lady Theodora interrupted. "And you waited years to speak?" The question was sharp, designed to destroy his credibility. Mr. Bellamy lowered his eyes. "Yes, I did." A few guests exchanged glances. He continued, "Because I was afraid." Then he looked around the room. "But being afraid does not make what happened disappear." That sentence settled over the ballroom, because everyone understood it. Many of them had been afraid too, afraid to question a duke, afraid to challenge a duchess, afraid to become the next person removed from polite society. Lady Theodora turned toward the duke. "You will allow this?" The duke did not answer immediately, and for one painful moment, Evelyn wondered if he would retreat again, if old habits would return, if the man who had chosen silence for years would choose it once more when it mattered most. Then he stepped forward. Yes, the word was quiet, but everyone heard it. Lady Theodora stared at him. The Duke looked at the guests. "I allowed this family to believe that silence was the same as dignity. It was not. No one moved. No one spoke. I believed I was protecting Ashcombe. Instead, I allowed decisions to be made without fairness." His eyes moved toward Evelyn. "And I failed my daughter." The confession was simple. No dramatic speech, no attempt to excuse himself, just the truth. Evelyn felt the room disappear for a moment. She had imagined this moment many times. She had imagined anger. She had imagined demanding answers. She had imagined making him understand the pain she carried. But hearing him admit it did not erase the years. It only proved those years had been real. The Duke continued. "The original inheritance papers were not destroyed. They were moved, and I allowed myself to believe it was for the good of the family." He turned toward Lady Theodora. "I was wrong." Theodora's face hardened. "You would destroy everything we built because of one emotional daughter." The words revealed more than she intended. Because Evelyn saw several guests react. They heard it. Not a concern for justice, not a concern for the estate. A concern that control was being lost. Mr. Harcourt carefully unfolded the final document. This paper was found among the Duchess's private records. It confirms that Lady Evelyn was to be protected from any alteration of her inheritance rights without proper review. Lady Theodora laughed softly. Protected? From whom? No one answered, because the answer was standing in front of them. The room knew, the servants knew, the Duke knew, and now society knew. The woman who had once used the room to humiliate Evelyn had created the place where Evelyn would finally be believed. A lady near the fireplace spoke quietly. "How could we not have known?" Mrs. Whitmore looked at her. "Because knowing would have required someone to ask." The sentence was gentle, but it carried a deeper accusation. The guests who had laughed before now looked uncomfortable. Some avoided Evelyn's eyes. Others approached slowly, offering apologies that came years too late. Evelyn accepted some. Others she simply acknowledged with silence. She had learned something during her time away. Forgiveness was not the same as pretending nothing happened, and kindness did not require forgetting. Lady Theodora remained near the center of the room. For once, no one moved toward her. No one waited for her approval. The doors that had always opened because of her name now seemed uncertain. The Duke spoke with Mr. Harcourt about restoring the proper estate arrangements. The legal matters would take time. The records would need careful review. But the truth was no longer hidden. It had entered the room. And once truth entered a room like Ashcombe Hall, it was very difficult to force it back outside. Later that night, After the guests had departed, Evelyn walked into the garden. The rain had stopped. The ground was still wet beneath her shoes. The cold air touched her face. For the first time since she was sent away, she stood there without feeling like an outsider. The garden had always been her mother's favorite place, a place where voices became softer, where people spoke honestly. Her father found her there. He stopped a few steps away. "I do not expect you to forgive me." Evelyn looked toward the dark trees. "Good." The Duke accepted the answer. "Because I know forgiveness cannot be demanded." They stood quietly. Then he said, "But I hope one day you will believe that I am trying to become better than the man I was." Evelyn looked at him. Not the Duke. Her father. "I hope you do." It was not a reunion. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were all that could honestly be offered. Inside Ashcombe Hall, the rooms that had once carried whispers now carried uncomfortable conversations. The estate would change. The family would change. And Evelyn would no longer live as someone waiting to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. And that choice changed everything that followed. In the months after the gathering at Ashcombe Hall, the estate became a different place. Not instantly, not magically. Old houses did not change simply because the truth had been spoken once. There were still difficult conversations. There were still legal matters to settle. There were still people who found it uncomfortable to admit that they had accepted a lie because believing it had been easier than questioning it. But the difference was that Evelyn was no longer standing alone. The estate records were reviewed carefully. The missing arrangements connected to her inheritance were restored through proper channels. The money that had been moved without explanation was accounted for. The papers her mother had protected for so many years finally served the purpose for which they had been saved. Not revenge, not punishment, protection. Evelyn never asked for Lady Theodora to suffer. She only asked for the truth to be acknowledged. That was something Lady Theodora found harder to accept than any public accusation. For years, she had believed power came from controlling what people knew. She had controlled conversations. She had controlled invitations. She had controlled who was allowed through the doors of Ashcombe Hall. But she had never understood that the people she dismissed were also the people who carried memories. And memories, when joined together, could become stronger than influence. Lady Theodora eventually withdrew from public gatherings. The invitations that once arrived regularly became fewer. The names that once welcomed her into drawing rooms became distant. There was no dramatic punishment, no cruel ending. Only the quiet consequence of losing the trust she had spent years spending carelessly. A person could survive criticism. But surviving the loss of confidence from those around them was much more difficult. The Duke remained at Ashcombe Hall. His relationship with Evelyn did not return to what it had been before. Neither of them pretended that years of silence could disappear overnight. There were conversations. There were apologies. There were moments when old pain returned. But there were also moments when he listened, truly listened. And for Evelyn, that mattered more than a perfect apology, because she had spent years surrounded by people who heard her words, but never allowed them to change anything. Now, finally, someone was learning to hear. Evelyn did not remain at Ashcombe Hall as a woman waiting for approval. She created a life of her own. The work she had begun in London continued. She helped manage accounts for families who had never been taught how to protect themselves financially. She supported women who found themselves abandoned by husbands or relatives with no understanding of their own affairs. She did not consider the work beneath her. She considered it necessary. The first time she signed her own agreement with a client, without using the Ashcombe name as protection, she sat quietly afterward and looked at the paper for a long moment. It was not a grand document. It did not carry a title. It did not have a family seal. But it belonged to her. And that was the first time in her life she understood what true independence felt like. Years later, when people spoke of Evelyn Ashcombe, they did not speak only of the daughter who had been sent away. They spoke of the woman who returned. The woman who entered the same ballroom where she had once been humiliated. The woman who stood calmly while people who had laughed before were forced to listen. The woman who proved that dignity did not come from a title. It came from refusing to surrender the truth of who you were. One winter afternoon, Evelyn walked through the garden at Ashcombe Hall. The same garden where she had once stood after the confrontation with her father. The trees were bare, the air was cold, but the cold no longer felt like punishment. It was simply winter. A servant passed carrying fresh flowers toward the house. A young girl from the village had been invited to learn bookkeeping from Evelyn. The household that had once measured a woman's worth by her usefulness to a family name was slowly becoming a place where knowledge could be shared. Evelyn stopped beside the old stone path. She thought of her mother, of the papers hidden away, of the courage it had taken to leave something behind for a daughter who might one day need it. She finally understood. Her mother had not only protected her inheritance, she had protected her belief that she mattered. And that belief had carried her farther than any fortune could have done. The rain had once followed her away from Ashcombe Hall. It had soaked her clothes. It had chilled her hands. It had marked the moment when she believed she had lost everything. But she no longer remembered that night as the moment she was abandoned. She remembered it as the night she began walking toward herself. Because sometimes the door that closes behind you is the one that allows you to find the road ahead. If this story of courage, justice, and finding one's own worth touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and support the channel for more stories of forgotten voices, finding their truth. But Evelyn Ashcombe's story did not truly end when the ballroom doors closed behind those who had once judged her. Because justice, she discovered, was not only found in moments of victory, it was found in what came after. The months following the revelation brought unexpected challenges. Some people who had praised Evelyn after the truth emerged had done so because they admired courage from a safe distance. But when courage required patience, responsibility, and change, admiration became more difficult. There were whispers that she had been fortunate. There were suggestions that she should now be satisfied and return quietly to the role society had prepared for her. Evelyn heard those whispers. She simply refused to let them decide her future. One spring morning, a letter arrived at Ashcombe Hall from a young woman in a nearby village. Her father had died, leaving behind accounts that no one in the family understood. Relatives were attempting to take control of what little remained, claiming she was incapable of managing it herself. Years earlier, Evelyn might have looked away. Not because she did not care, because she had believed there was little one person could do. Now she traveled to the village herself. The house was small. The furniture was worn. The woman who greeted her looked frightened, in the same way Evelyn had once looked frightened, standing in the Ashcombe ballroom. "I do not know what rights I have," the woman admitted. Evelyn looked at the papers spread across the table. "Then we will discover them." The words were simple, but they carried the memory of everything Evelyn had survived. She spent the afternoon reviewing the documents, explaining each account, each signature, each obligation. By evening, the woman understood. For the first time in weeks, she stopped looking like someone waiting to be told what would happen to her. She looked like someone who could decide. On the journey back to Ashcombe Hall, Evelyn watched the countryside pass beyond the carriage window. She thought about how easily a person could be made to feel powerless, not through chains, not through force, through confusion, through isolation, through convincing them that they had no voice. And she knew then that the greatest lesson of her own struggle was not that she had defeated Lady Theodora. It was that no one should have to lose everything before discovering their own worth. When she returned to Ashcombe Hall, she found her father waiting in the library. The same room where so many secrets had once been hidden, but the room felt different now. The locked cabinets had been opened. The old papers had been organized. The air no longer carried the feeling of something being concealed. The Duke looked at the documents she carried. "You helped her." Evelyn nodded. "I did." He smiled faintly. "Your mother would have been proud." For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. Those words were the ones she had wanted to hear for years. But she also knew something important. Her mother's pride had never depended upon another person saying it aloud. It had always been there. Still, she allowed herself to accept the kindness. "Thank you, Father." The word was quiet, not completely healed, not a return to the past. Something new, something built carefully. The Duke walked toward the window. "I spent years believing a family was protected by keeping its troubles hidden." Evelyn stood beside him. And now, he looked out toward the garden. Now I believe a family is protected when people inside it are brave enough to face what is wrong. Outside, the first signs of spring had begun to appear. The garden that had once held Evelyn's loneliness now held conversations, lessons, and new beginnings. Children from the village visited to learn reading and accounts. Servants who had once lowered their voices now spoke openly. The house was still old, the walls still carried memories, but the meaning of those walls had changed. Ashcombe Hall was no longer a place where silence ruled. It had become a place where truth had finally found a home. And Evelyn? She no longer measured her life by what had been taken from her. She measured it by what she had built. The rain that had followed her away from Ashcombe Hall had once seemed like the symbol of everything she had lost. But years later, whenever storms passed over the estate, she remembered something different. Rain did not only mark endings, sometimes it cleared the path for something new to grow, because the woman who had been ordered to leave had discovered that leaving was not the same as losing. And the voice that had once been ignored had become the voice that others trusted.